Okay, so I think this is actually recording. So, lecture 1-1, truth. Oh man, I needed to have like you can't handle the truth kind of joke on this. Like that should have been, God, missed opportunity.
It's glad you know that what we learned so far is not the truth.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you guys might find out some things about what you know in this class. So, before we can discuss mathematical truth, which is what we're going to discuss next time, we should begin with a discussion of truth itself. It is important to note that this is obviously extremely incomplete, this presentation. My aim is to give a sense of the subject via brutal misabbreviation. Okay. Of course, the study of truth cannot but be entangled with the study of the world as such, which is called metaphysics, and of knowledge, which is called epistemology. Some of the following theories of truth presuppose or imply a certain metaphysical and or epistemological theory, but which these are is controversial. So there are a lot of different camps that hold to these different ideas, and all of this is controversial. Every bit of this is going to be controversial, and yet we still have to come up with some idea. So here we go. Neoclassical theories of truth. The neoclassical theories of truth take for granted that there is truth and attempt to explain what its precise nature is. What are provided here are modern understandings of theories developed primarily in the early 20th century. The first one is the correspondence theory. A version of what is called the correspondence theory is the following. A proposition is true if and only if there is an existing entity in the world that corresponds with it. So, if with two F's is not a typo, it means if and only if. Okay? So, such existing entities are called facts. Facts are relational in that their parts, for example, the subject, predicate, etc., are related in a certain way. Under this theory, then, if a proposition does not correspond to a fact, it is false. This theory is rather intuitive and consistently popular. Okay, it would not be an understatement to say that most people use some version of this as their conception of truth. The coherence theory. The coherence theory of truth is adamant that the truth of any given proposition is only as good as its holistic system of propositions. This includes, but typically goes beyond, a requirement for consistency of a given proposition with the whole and the self-consistency of the whole itself, sometimes called coherence. For parallelism, let's attempt a succinct formulation of this theory cast in terms of propositions. A proposition is true if and only if it has coherence with a system of propositions. Note that this has no reference to facts whatsoever. However, it need not necessarily preclude them. It just says that truth is coherence with a system of propositions, which also has consistency. The entire system has consistency within itself. Okay. The pragmatic theory. Of the neoclassical theories of truth, this is probably the least agreed upon as having a single clear statement. However, as with pragmatism in general, the pragmatic truth is oriented practically. Perhaps the most important aspect of this theory is that it is thoroughly a correspondence theory, agreeing that true propositions are those that correspond to the world. However, there is a different focus here that differentiates it from correspondence theory proper. It values as more true that which has some sort of practical use in human life. We'll try to summarize pragmatism in two slogans with slightly different emphases. Here's the first, again cast in propositional parallel. A proposition is true if and only if it works. Now, there are two ways this can be understood. A, the proposition works in that it empirically corresponds to the world, or B, the proposition works in that it has an effect that some agent intends. The former is pretty standard correspondence theory. The latter is new and fairly obviously has ethical implications, especially today. So, a proposition might work to deceive a bunch of people. And under this theory, it would then be true. However, that also brings up a lot of ethical questions that we're not going to get into. So, let us turn to a second formulation. A proposition is true if it corresponds with a process of inquiry. This has two interesting facets. An agent's activity, an agent's active inquiry creates truth, and B, it is a sort of correspondence theory that requires a correspondence of a proposition with a process of inquiry, not, as in the correspondence theory, with a fact about the world. The latter has shades of both correspondence theory and coherence theory. It's correspondence with a process of inquiry, right? So a proposition is true if it corresponds with the process of inquiry. So if you're inquiring in a certain way into something and you come up with a proposition that corresponds with it, then it is true. The picture theories. This is not a neoclassical one. This one's a little bit more modern. Before we delve into this theory, we must take a moment to clarify some terminology. And I'll also mention that all the ones above, these neoclassical theories, are very much still popular. All of these are still popular to some extent. I didn't give you guys any that are just like nobody really believes in anymore. This is like, these theories are still considered to be, reasonable theories, I guess. So, states of affairs and facts. When discussing the correspondence theory, we have used the term fact to mean an actual state of things in the world. A problem arises in the correspondence theory here. It says that a proposition is true if and only if there is a fact that corresponds with it. What of negative propositions like, there are no cows in Antarctica? We would seem to need a corresponding negative fact in the world to make this true. If a fact is taken to be composed of a complex of actual objects and relations, it is hard to imagine such facts. Furthermore, if a proposition is true, it seems that it is the corresponding fact that makes it so. What then makes a proposition false, since there is no fact to support the falsity? And what of nonsense? There are some propositions like, there is a round cube, that are neither true nor false. However, the preceding correspondence theory cannot differentiate between false and nonsensical propositions. A state of affairs is a new term that we're introducing, is something possible that may or may not be actual. If a state of affairs is actual, it is said to obtain. The picture theory will make central this concept instead of that of the fact. Okay? So the picture theory of meaning and truth is, the picture theory of meaning uses the analogy of the model or picture to explain the meaningfulness of propositions. A proposition names possible objects and arranges these names to correspond to a state of affairs. See this figure here. So we have objects in some possible world, not necessarily the actual world, but it's some possible situation, some possible state of affairs with objects arranged in a way that is somehow possible. Okay? And we then name these objects, okay? And then we arrange the names in such a way that it corresponds to this possible world, okay? This proposition, so this is the proposition, which is a model or a picture of what's going on. This also allows for an easy account of truth, falsity, and nonsense. Nonsense. A sentence that appears to be a proposition is actually not if the arrangement of named objects is impossible. Such a sentence is simply nonsense. Truth. A proposition is true if the state of affairs it depicts obtains. False. Falsity. A proposition is false if the state of affairs it depicts does not obtain. Now, some argue this is a correspondence theory, and others that it is not. In any case, it certainly solves some issues that have plagued the correspondence theory. So, it has some advantages at least. What cannot be said must be shown. Something the picture theory does is declare a limit on what can meaningfully be said. A proposition, as defined above, must be potentially true or false. Therefore, something that cannot be false, something necessarily true, cannot be a proposition. And there are certain things that are necessarily true for language itself to be meaningful. Paradigmatically, the logical structure of the world. What a proposition does, then, is show, via its own logical structure, the necessary, for there to be meaningful propositions at all, logical structure of the world. An interesting feature of this perspective is that it opens up language itself to analysis and limitation. And furthermore, it suggests that the set of what is smaller than the set of what can is larger. So that backwards, larger. Is larger. So it suggests that the set of what is larger than the set of what can be meaningfully spoken about. The relativity of truth. Each subject, i.e. agent in the world, with their propositions, has a perspective, a given moment, a given place, and a historical, cultural, linguistic situation. At the very least, the truth of propositions must account for this. Just how a theory of truth should do so is a matter of significant debate. Some go so far as to be skeptical about truth, regarding it to be entirely impossible. Others say that while a proposition may or may not be true, we could never come to know this. Often underlying this conversation is the question of there being a common world in which we all participate, and if so, whether or not we can properly represent this world in language such that multiple subjects could come to justifiably agree or disagree on the truth of a proposition. If every proposition is so relative that it is relevant to only the proposer, truth would seem of little value. If it's only true for the person who says it, truth is of little value, it seems. On the other hand, if truth is understood to be objective, independent of subjective perspective, a number of objections can be made, such that there is no non-subjective perspective from which to judge truth. Other ideas about truth. There are many. There are too many credible ideas about truth to attempt a reasonable summary. However, I will attempt to highlight a few important ones. Formal methods. A set of tools was developed for exploring theories of truth, especially correspondence theories. Focus turned from beliefs to sentences, which are akin to propositions. Recall that the above theories have already been recast in the more modern language of propositions. A couple of them were originally stated in terms of belief, and just for uniformity of presentation, I've recast them in terms of proposition. Another aspect of these sentences under consideration is that they begin to be taken as interpreted sentences. They already have meaning. They already have meaning. I edited this too. I missed some stuff. Beyond this, several technical apparatus are introduced that formalize criteria for truth. For instance, a sentence is given a sign phi. A need arises to distinguish between the quotation of sentence phi and the unquoted sentence phi, which is then given the quasi-quotation notation. I'll call it bracket phi. Okay. For instance, let phi stand for snow is white. Then phi is snow is white, and bracket phi is the quotation snow is white. Tarski introduced convention T, which states that for a fixed language L with fully interpreted sentences, an adequate theory of truth for L must imply for each sentence phi of L, bracket phi is true if and only if phi. Okay? So using the same example then, quote, snow is white, if and only if snow is white. Okay? So there's this thing that's happening here that I'm not talking about, which is that this later thing is written in a meta language, and the original language L is what contains phi. Okay? So you have to be able to interpret phi in the meta language to speak about the truth of phi. And it allows you to use symbols to represent a sentence without, if you put, the issue is if you put quote phi, then the question is, do you put the actual sentence phi in there, or is it just phi? Are you just talking about phi? And that's where this comes in. This also shows up in programming quite a bit. So there's this thing, so in Python, you would write the new Python 3-way to write a formatted string is f quote hello, and then maybe you have a variable that is a name, and so you put in bracket name, then it'll take name and it'll put it in there. So it'll be like, hello, Bob. If you have a variable up here, it's like name equals Bob. It'll plug name in there. If you didn't do that, if you just wrote f a hello name, it's not going to plug name in. So it's like that. It's like that kind of, it's a device for doing something. So there's all these like formal things that they developed for talking about language, for talking about truth, and this is, so an adequate theory of truth must imply for each sentence phi that the quote of the sentence phi is true if and only if it is the case that phi. So snow is white if and only if snow is white. Convention T states a general rule for the adequacy of a truth theory and is used in several contemporary theories. We can see that these formal methods get quite technical and fun. Okay. For more, see these references. And I also have, there's a lot of citations, and there's now an annotated bibliography at the end that describes annotates some of these references for you. Deflationary theories. Deflationary theories of truth try to minimize or eliminate altogether the concept of or use of the term truth. For instance, the redundancy theory claims that to assert that bracket phi is true is just to assert that phi. Therefore, they conclude, we can eliminate the use of is true. There's a whole lot here, and they go into very, very incredible detail. For more of less, see this reference on Deflationary Theories of Truth. Language. It is important to recognize that language mediates truth. That is, truth is embedded in language. The way language in general affects theories of truth has been studied extensively. For instance, whether the truth bearer is a belief or a proposition or a sentence or something else has been much discussed. The importance of the meaning of truth bearers, like sentences, has played another large role. Theories of meaning, like the picture theory presented above, are often closely intertwined with theories of truth. One of the most popular theories of meaning is called the theory of use, which states that this is one statement of it, for a large class of cases of the employment of the word meaning, though not for all, this word can be explained in this way. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. This theory is accompanied by the concept of language games, which are loosely defined as rule-based contexts within which sentences have uses. The idea is that the meaning of a given sentence is its use in a network of meaning that is constantly evolving. This view tends to be understood as deflationary or relativistic about truth. It's also very popular. So Wittgenstein, the guy who came up with this, was also the guy who came up with the picture theory of truth. The picture theory was his early work, and it was a radical thing that he wrote. He thought he had solved all of the problems of philosophy in this one little book that he wrote called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And he moved on. He's like, I'm done with philosophy, solved it, and he moved on to other things. Then later on in his career, in his life, he returned to philosophy and recognized that the meaning of words and statements and propositions actually have uses beyond corresponding to something in the world. And so he came up with this language games idea, that we're participating in all these language games when we use language. We're participating in a language game, and it has some meaning in a given context and some use in that context. So that theory of meaning has some implications about truth that tend to be deflationary and relativistic, which are very broad terms. And so I don't mean at all, I'm not trying to convince us one direction or another. These are one of the things I really wanted to make sure in this lecture is to recognize that it's really easy in these discussions to build a straw man version of a theory and then knock it down. And it's good not to do that because, it's something that people do constantly. Even like professional philosophers do this all the time. But building a straw man of like some opponent in an argument and then knocking it down might be good rhetorically, but it's not necessarily going to get you any closer to an understanding of what's going on. So I think that realizing that a lot of smart people have every view that we're presenting here should give you pause if you feel the tendency to just be like, no, that one's totally bonkers, obviously, and dismiss it. It's worth considering them before dismissing them if you choose to do it. It's a very good thing to learn as you developed to not necessarily dismiss a view on the face of it. Okay. And sometimes it's good to just dismiss a view on the face of it because it's terrible. So, there's that too. So, metaphysical and epistemological considerations. We began with the recognition that truth is intertwined with metaphysics and epistemology. Let's consider a few such topics. The first is metaphysical realism, which claims that there is a world existing objectively, or independently of how we think about or describe it. This realism tends to be closely tied to, yet distinct from, scientific realism, which goes further, claiming the world is actually as science describes it, independently of the scientific descriptions. For example, there are actual objects corresponding to the phenomena we call atoms, molecules, light particles, etc. There have been many challenges to the realist claim. For some recent versions, see this article, but put forth by what is broadly called anti-realism. These vary, but often challenge the ability of realists to properly link language to supposed objects in the world. Metaphysical idealism has been characterized as claiming that mind or subjectivity generate or completely compose the world, which has no being outside mind. Epistemological idealism, on the other hand, while perhaps conceding that there is a world independent of mind, claims all knowledge of the world is created through mind and for mind, and therefore can never escape a sort of mind-world gap. This epistemological idealism has been highly influential since the work of Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, which ushered in the idea of the noumenal world in itself and the phenomenal world, which is how the noumenal world presents to us. Many have held that phenomena can be known through inquiry, whereas noumena are inaccessible. The things in themselves are inaccessible. You can only know about the phenomena that come. The thing in itself is inaccessible. Furthermore, what can be known is restricted by the categories pre-existent in the knower. Okay, so this was a big, Kantian epistemology was a very huge influence on the modern world that continues to today. Another approach taken by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and other German idealists following Kant is to reframe reality as thoroughly integrating subjectivity. That is, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. A subject's proposition is true inasmuch as it corresponds with its notion, approximately the idea or meaning for the subject. So this notion that the subject is trying to convey in the proposition is the correspondence that the proposition must have. So the proposition is true in as much as it corresponds to the notion that is trying to be conveyed in the proposition. Some hold that this idealism is compatible with a sort of metaphysical realism, at least as far as understanding is not independent but rather beholden to reality. Clearly, all these ideas have many implications for theories of truth and vice versa. So if you're a metaphysical realist, surely that's going to affect how you think truth works. If you're a metaphysical idealist and everything is just in minds, okay, that's going to affect how your theories of truth works. If you're an epistemological idealist where there is the noumenal world in itself that we can't ever quite access, all we can do is get at it as close as possible from the phenomena that we encounter, that's going to affect your understanding of truth. So all these things have a lot of implications that I'm not going to even try to summarize at all. Where this leaves us. The truth is hard, okay? What may at first appear to be a simple concept becomes complex upon analysis. It is important to recognize that we have only sampled some highlights of the theories of truth. I recommend further study of this fascinating topic. Despite the difficulties of finding definitive grounds for understanding truth, we are faced with the task of provisionally forging ahead. Much of what follows in the study of mathematics makes certain implicit and explicit assumptions about truth. However, we have found that the foundations of these assumptions may themselves be problematic. It is my contention that despite the lack of clear foundations, it is still worth studying engineering analysis, its mathematical foundations, and the foundations of truth itself. My justification for this claim is that I find the utility and the beauty of this study highly rewarding, and I'm confident that you will too. Even if you don't get to a final resting point in your study, studying it is still very rewarding, and I find it to be exciting and fascinating and better than TV. So.
After reading all of the theory, it sounds more confusing than we don't read it.
Yeah, right, exactly. The more you learn, the less you know. Yeah, is I think how that goes. But that's not to say that we can't make any progress either. So you can see all these theories, and then what we tend to do is we don't completely objectively encounter these ideas. We have some sort of agenda, right? We all kind of we're like, I don't like this version. This version doesn't agree with how I see the world or my life or the meaning of life that I experience. And we typically, what we do is we take a position. We're like, okay, I'm a metaphysical realist, and this is what I think truth is. And then you go forward and you're like, okay, and then you're like, there are some issues with this, and then you kind of work on those, and then maybe you'll find that you fall in love with another sort of understanding with it. Like, this is what it is, and you study that one, and you feel like that's really where you're at. Of course, there's a difference between coming to a sort of rest in terms of your own study and solving all the problems, right? I mean, very few of us are going to be like Wittgenstein and just walk away. Just be like, solve philosophy, done, and just walk away. Even he eventually came back to it. So I think it's always going to be a process. It doesn't mean that there's no progress being made. Just because you haven't completely finished something doesn't mean that you haven't made progress towards a goal. So, yeah. So that's my sort of spiel on truth, and we're gonna take this. We're gonna lead into mathematical truth, because mathematics. I didn't really talk about mathematics too much in this lecture. Mathematics has historically had a really, really high. Has really been highly regarded for how it can establish truth. So even if you doubt some things in the world, like this or that, you'd still believe that if you have two lines that are parallel, they'll never meet, like that kind of thing, geometric sort of argument. However, mathematical truth has had its own really interesting history, and I'll talk a little bit about that next time. So we're going to be using it as it's essentially what all of engineering analysis is built on, is math. And math has had some issues with truth too. And so I'll try to tie that back into this as well. Okay, so that's all we have for today, though.